Alright, what's going on, everyone? While Standard may have recently rotated with the release of Dominaria United, I am pleased to announce that many of the Standard Challenger decks from last year are still quite playable in the new Standard. Today we're looking at Rakdos Vampires, and I'll show you what you can do to make this deck legal in the new Standard. So here is the original deck list, not upgraded, not with my upgrades. This is stock out of the box, and if we highlight in red the cards we lost to rotation, you can see that we lost almost nothing. A couple cards in the main board, a couple lands, a card in the sideboard, but this is basically playable out of the box. In fact, you could buy this and just replace the lands with basics and replace those cards in the main board with cards from the sideboard and literally play this out of the box. And you can still buy this deck on Amazon for $25. Here's the screenshot. Not encouraging you to buy it from Amazon. Please buy it from your local game store, but these are old, maybe they don't have them. So my point is, these are still available, they're cheap, and you can use sideboard cards, move them over to the main board, and play this out of the box with, technically, you need to add a few basics. That's it. So yeah, what are we losing? Well, in the main board, we're losing 4 copies of Sturm Predator and 1 Village Rites. The dragon is good, definitely a good card, good vampire threat, but there's plenty of other good, solid vampires we can play in this slot, and Village Rites wasn't entirely necessary. This deck had a minor, steal the opponent's stuff and sacrifice it theme, but it's not necessary. So what do we add for Sturm Predator? I wasn't joking about those sideboard cards. I think we can start by taking out 2 of the dragons for 2 Anjis from the sideboard and just putting it right into the deck. So this is free. You have this in your sideboard now. Anji's great. She makes blood tokens every time you play vampires. That's very good for this deck because we like to use Oni Cult Anvil to sacrifice blood tokens to make 1/1 creatures. Can also turn them into 3/1s with Sockins and Smelter. And also, if we have a ton of them, we can flip a Bloodcaster. So Anji's great. Totally fine to just get 2 Predators out, 2 Anjis in. We can take out a third Sturm Predator for our 3rd copy of Florian. Florian is so good that we could potentially just play a full 4 copies, because what's so great about him is, even though he's legendary creatures, it's sketchy to play 4 of them because you can only have 1 on the battlefield at once. So what happens if you draw 3 of them and you already have 1 on the board, right? It can be clunky and awkward, but with Florian, at least he helps you draw into extra gas. So he sort of makes up for that. But I'm still going to stick at 3. 1 Sturm Predator out for 1 Florian. And Florian's great at generating card advantage, getting you extra vampires, stuff like that. And I think the final Sturm Predator can just go into a Vampire Socialite. Well, this is less exciting. It's not a big giant vampire dragon. The Socialite adds a lot of aggression to the stack, especially with how many ways we can deal damage in the first main phase. We have lots of ways to just kind of deal incidental damage. But even if we can't, Socialite just puts a bunch of counters, allows us to kind of keep up an aggressive tempo, which is nice. And that leaves us with the 1 copy of Village Rites, and I think this can just go straight into our 4th copy of Vampire Socialite. Well, we are taking out a card draw spell for just another vampire. Keep in mind we did just add a Florian, which helps us get cards, so I think we're maintaining that balance. That's fine. And while these aren't exactly similar, this doesn't do a similar thing. There is a card in Standard if you really want this effect. The name is, I'll put it on screen. This card is very similar, and you can play this if you want, but I would just prefer to have the Vampire Socialite, personally. So yeah, either way, either of these cards can go in this slot. They're both cheap, both commons and uncommons. It's fine. And one final change I think is worth making to the main board. This isn't necessary as your main board is currently Standard legal, but I don't really like these Mukotai Soul Ripper things. I'd rather take 2 of those out for 2 Oni Cult Anvils. Oni Cult Anvils makes this deck super grindy and mid-rangey, and it's just super cool. Big fan of Oni Cult Anvil in Standard. Big fan of Oni Cult Anvil in Pioneer too, kind of. But it's just, it's a great card. You basically sacrifice your blood tokens, make 1/1s. Oni Cult Anvil is great. Works well with all the blood tokens and stuff. So yeah, I just prefer this. And that brings us to the mana base. We're losing 2 Den of the Bugbear and 2 Blightstep pathways. So first, I think one pathway can go right into a Voldaren estate. These, you might not notice it right away, but it's not legendary. It seems like it should be legendary. It's a specific building, but not legendary. So there's no harm in playing 4 copies. Well, there's a little bit of harm. It costs life to activate, but there's no harm in terms of the legendary rule. I also think it's fine to replace one of the Den of the Bugbears with one Sakenzen Crucible of Defiance. This land's a little pricey. It's like $3 or $4 USD, so consider it optional, but it can be channeled for a couple 1/1s, so not quite the same as the Den of the Bugbear, but similar in that, we can get a board presence from our lands. I only want one though because it's legendary, and it's not fun to draw these in multiple, especially in your opening hand. Having an opening hand where you have like 3 lands and 2 of them are Sakenzens just doesn't feel good, so 1 copy's fine. And that leaves us with 1 each of Blightstep Pathway and Den. So in the perfect world, I would say these would just be Haunted Ridges. Pretty simple. These out, Haunted Ridges, and the problem is, sadly, these are quite expensive. They're like $12 to $13 each in US dollars, so literally 2 of them is more expensive than the entire deck. On a budget, we also have Sulphurous Springs, but I'm actually not super happy with these in this deck because we already have a playset of Voldaren estates. Painlands are great, especially in aggro decks where your life isn't as relevant, but it's a little bit scary to play 6 total Painlands. 6, it's a little high. I don't know if I want to play 6 of them. So ideally, if you have Haunted Ridges, you can put them in the place of these 2 lands, but for now, until we get maybe another budget land that doesn't enter tapped and doesn't, ping us every time we tap it, maybe it just basics are fine for now. So non-budget Haunted Ridges, budget, just play basics. That's fine. There's also Takenuma. This is also a possibility. Cards a little expensive. I think they're like $5 to $6 each right now. And once again, you only want 1. It's better than a swamp, that's for sure, but I'm not going to officially recommend it just because of the price, but if you have one, that's also fine. So, the sideboard. I would consider filling the empty slots we have with cards like Flame Blessed Bolt for the black aggro decks, Graveyard Trespasser for Graveyard Hate. This is common, even though it's not a vampire, pretty common, and vampire sideboards to bring in against graveyard combo decks. Cut Down is also very good for aggro decks. Red aggro in particular can bring these in. Just have a 1 mana, wipe out your stupid little red creature that's giving me problems the first couple turns. And there's plenty of other situational sideboard cards. I always encourage people to tailor your sideboard to what you're playing against in your local metagame. So always be aware of what you're losing to and adjust your sideboard accordingly. And that's it. That's all this deck needed. It needed 5 cards, main board, a couple lands, and just some sideboard stuff. It's fine. As I mentioned, if you don't have a deck, like if you want to play standard and you just don't have a deck at all, and you're like, I want to play, but Challenger decks come out in the spring, so they're not going to come out with a new batch for, 6 months from now. So, what do I do for now? The answer is you can just go buy this and literally take sideboard cards, move them into the main board to replace the Predator and the Village Rites, and you're good to go. Basics too, basics for the rotated lands, but that's it. And then you can just refill your sideboard with whatever, and there you go. You have a deck that's standard legal from last year or the last batch of Challenger decks. So vampires aren't tier 1, so that's notable. But I mean, this is a super cheap way to get into standard. Literally, you can buy this on Amazon, $25. Go to your local game store. You're good to go. Is it a tier 1 deck? Is it going to win F&M? That's going to depend on how competitive your local game store is. But it's definitely a cheap way to get into the format if you're just looking for something to play for now. So there you go. Hopefully that's helpful. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.